The final session of the 2025 NPF Rare Diseases Reporting Fellowship brings us full circle. We've had evocative conversations about issues like storytelling, biotech advances, mental health, and youth advocacy. But there's a common theme that runs through all of those topics, and that would be access to funding. We're privileged today to hear from three leading experts in the rare disease funding space. Our final session will be led by Rebecca Beattie, the CEO of Launch Bio, a national nonprofit connecting life science entrepreneurs with capital, talent, and strategic partners. Becky will introduce her co-panelists, Teri Willey, the Managing Director and Officer of Pathway to Cures, and Casey McPherson, the founder of AlphaRose Therapeutics. Thank you all so much for joining us today. And Becky, please take it away.
Thank you, Rachel, and thank you to the National Press Foundation for inviting us here today. As Rachel mentioned, my name is Rebecca Beattie. You can call me Becky Beattie, CEO of Launch Bio. We are a nonprofit created to support early stage, high growth, high impact life science companies by connecting them to capital and resources. And one of the programs we run is called Invest in Cures, and it exists because there's a critical gap in how rare disease innovation gets funded. We now have technologies like gene editing and AI-enabled diagnostics that can treat diseases that we once thought were untreatable. But too often, the science is it's advancing faster than the funding models. So what we're talking about today is more than a market problem. It's really a modern day civil rights issue. And I'm lending that from a conversation with Casey. Access to cures shouldn't depend on where a child is born or whether the disease is commercially viable. So today's conversation will explore new ways to fund hope, from crowdfunding that can enable families to invest directly in their future to foundation-led capital, which is a blend of purpose and profit. And since you're all journalists, we'll also talk about the stories, the ones that you tell that can drive awareness and urgency and help these models take root, especially in developing countries. So as Rachel mentioned, we're joined by two remarkable leaders in our industry, Casey McPherson, who is the founder of and CEO of AlphaRose Therapeutics, who is pioneering community-powered biotech, I'll call it. His company develops genetic therapies for children with ultra-rare diseases, and he's raising capital through regulation, crowdfunding, and we'll get into that in a bit. Teri Willey is Managing Director of Pathways to Cures, the venture philanthropy arm of the National Bleeding Disorder Foundation. Teri's fund channels investor capital, not donations, into early stage companies, helping them turn research into real treatments. So I think we'll start today with you, Casey, and your work began as a parent fighting for your own child's life, and it's evolved into a company that's letting families become investors in the cure. So tell us a little bit about your personal story and how it's led to this particular funding model.
Yeah, absolutely. And I apologize. I didn't make it quite to the place I wanted to be. So if you hear music in the background, it's because I'm holed up at a coffee shop in the middle of, I don't even know where I am right now. So I will start with that a big reason why I have arrived where I am is due to the publicity that I have been able to have from the writers and the interviewers that, like yourselves, that have helped stand up my story. So, maybe start off with the power that you all have is not just necessary, it's critical to change this landscape. So, my story starts with being a dad of two beautiful girls, and my youngest daughter, Rose, began to choke on her food. She would fall on her face, not put her hands in front of her. And then she lost her ability to talk. And So a lot of the parents that have children with rare genetic diseases go through what's called a diagnostic odyssey, because most of our healthcare systems don't know that they need to run a genetic sequence on um, these patients, because most of the time we only test for diseases that currently have drugs. But the reason it's a civil rights issue now is because there's thousands and thousands of diseases. We probably all have friends or family with, that know some special needs, a family member or severely autistic or suffers from some sort of disease that nobody seems to be able to cure. It's actually about a 1 in 20 chance that can occur, and we were one of them. And so, I ran a genetic sequence, and the pediatric neurologist, and granted, if you're not in the US and you may think that the US has one of the best healthcare systems in the world, well, we hit the dead end. And the pediatric neurologist said, Casey, your daughter has a rare genetic disease. There is no cure. There's nothing we can do. Good luck. And what I learned, I literally Googled parent cures child of rare disease. That's where I started. And so I found articles which were written from people like yourselves about parents that had raised the millions of dollars necessary to create a genetic treatment for their child or this group of children and get it into a clinical trial. And what I also learned was that many of them start foundations because it's the current business model of drug development does not support 90+% of these rare diseases because they're all very small populations. We have the technology to treat and cure many of them, but we don't have the business models for it. So families are having to tell their story, show their children, their family members. And that's what we did. We made a video, and I talked to the local paper and started interviewing with different people, and they shared our story. And I was able to raise enough money in the foundation to create what's called a preclinical treatment for my daughter, due to many, many $100 donations, $1,000 donations, $20 donations. And it came from thousands of people all over the world that bought into Rose's story. Science doesn't really move people. The metrics of 400 million suffer, 10,000 rare diseases, that doesn't really move people. As you guys are storytellers, you know that the story of these patients is what moves people. And it did. And so we raised money, we made a treatment, and we realized we had a pathway to make many, many more treatments for many, many more of these diseases. And so we started a company, AlphaRose Therapeutics, which is a public benefit corporation, to develop these treatments, treat these patients, and create a business model so we could commercialize these small population medicines at scales. And, I've had to rely on the community to help stand up our different, endeavors. And it's because of the community that we've got this far.
So you mentioned that your crowdfunding campaign, because is that what you're referring to with the donations coming in, or was that with the foundation?
Yeah, so initially we crowdfunded through the foundation, through Facebook and GoFundMe and these other things. I never got a really big donation from anyone. If you guys are worried about, well, I don't know any, it was community driven. And then when we started the company, we looked for a community driven way to raise capital, because now I could raise money from investors. And so what we did was we did something called a regulation crowdfunding, which in the US is a way that you can raise investment publicly with as little as, a few $100s that people can buy shares of your company. So we did that through an organization called Start Engine, a broker. And we had, hundreds of investors come in to raise, another, it was over almost $2 million that we raised through that crowd fund. And it accomplishes two things. It accomplishes that you can raise money through your community, but it also shares the story with more and more people, because one of our biggest issues right now is education for investors, that they know that's actually a pretty lucrative and impactful way to invest your money, because these drugs don't cost $1 billion to develop. They're actually much cheaper to develop, and they're very high impact drugs. So they make a huge impact on patients. But it has to be outside. Most of them have to be outside the current pharma model. And
Right.
so, we got interviews in local magazines and online things and radio stations and podcasts, and People magazine and Newsweek eventually picked it up. But the spark of the fundraising really was driven largely by people outside of us telling the story.
So as we're considering the context of this conversation with our international journalist, in countries where access to capital is limited, do you see this crowdfunding model as something that could help patient groups pool resources for early research, not just that early stage research?
Absolutely, I think it's critical. So a couple of things that if I could wave a magic wand to a bunch of journalists and writers across the world, I would say look for these families that are helping to create this new model, this new system, that are trying to cure their kid, that are looking for a treatment, that are raising this awareness. And by telling that story and providing the link of whether they're donating or investing. And this was actually the hardest part for me, is to get the journalist to actually put the link in the thing, so it could drive people to taking action. And so there are people in your community, wherever you are, that need this help. And it's not a U.S. problem, it's not an Africa problem, it's not a China problem, it's a global problem. But if we can each take those people and stand them up, take these families and take these stories and stand them up, it will compel the philanthropists, it will compel the investors, it will compel our medical system and our government to do something about it. But I will say that one of the reasons you don't hear, if you haven't heard many of these stories, it's because most of these families are surviving day to day. When you have a family member like this with one of these diseases, it's touch and go. So you're not going out to dinner and hanging out with your friends. You're just trying to make it through that day. So they're almost like they're silent captives, if you will, that require other people to come alongside them and lift them up. Which in this case, the pen is the sword, and it's a very impactful one, for these stories.
Well, you're such an eloquent speaker. You just answered my next two questions without me even asking.
Sorry, I should have had your questions.
No, it's beautiful. I meant that's exactly what my kind of closing question specifically for you was, if you could tell reporters one thing about what families are facing, and I think that's it right there.
Yeah, and I think we have a huge opportunity, and I'm watching some journalists in the U.S. that I know take this on. But I think this is, if this is resonating with you, if this idea resonates with you, you can create change in your community and in your country, by writing about this and writing about and be honest about it, writing about the disparity here, that we do have technology to treat many of these diseases. Why are we not treating this person? Why does this person not have access to this technology? And that's why I go back to it being a civil rights issue, because if we have the technology, then we should be able to use it. And so obviously our models aren't working, our systems aren't working. And And it's really up to us and up to you guys, I think, to spotlight that. And if more journalists did spotlight it, I think we would see a snowball effect of leadership and all the different areas taking action, because it becomes one loud voice, as opposed to lots of tiny little voices.
Well, and I think, I hesitate to use the term, we're at an exciting turning point, but I really think we are, because the technologies, like you said, are there, but the business model needs to shift. But it is really, truly an opportunity for journalists and, a lot of other folks, but today, in the context of this, journalists, to be part of this change. It's about to leapfrog. And I think in 20 years, it's going to look very different for the benefit of patients. So I'm going to shift gears and go to Teri now with Pathways to Cures. Teri and her fund are redefining what it means for capital to have a conscience, if you will. This is a combination of investment returns with measurable impact. So, Teri, how do you explain this model to people who assume philanthropy and profit don't coexist?
Yeah. A lot of my career has been acting at the interface of for-profit and not-for-profit organizations to have an impact on society. And it's a space that's hard to get to work well, but when it does, it's one of the most satisfying things you can be involved in, because we do live among not-for-profit and for-profit programs and entities and systems. So Pathway to Cures is very much like a very traditional early stage biotech venture fund, in that we invest money in early stage companies that have promising solutions, curative therapies, and in our case, specifically for blood and bleeding disorders, inheritable blood and bleeding disorders. Most of these, almost all of them, are rare diseases. Where we are unusual, in addition to our very laser focus on blood and bleeding disorders, is that the money that we invest comes from donors. So there's not a return to limited partners in venture speak. We're not sharing the profits with third parties that have put money in. The returns, if there are returns, if the company is successful in bringing an idea forward to patients, those returns go back into the not-for-profit to deliver on mission in education, in advocacy, in research, and in further investment in innovation. So again, it's very traditional investing, best practice inventing, but where the money comes from and where it goes is nuanced. It's slightly different. So it also means, like Casey's Benefit Corporation, in addition to doing what's best for shareholders, you also weight equally what's best for patients, what's best for society, and so forth.
Can you tell us an example of a company that you met, interacted with, and had a successful outcome, and how was that relationship formed, and how did it develop?
Yeah, one of the hypotheses when we set this up was that even though we would be writing small checks because we were disease specific, we understood the nuances of preclinical and clinical design for our rare diseases, and that we had a strong network of individuals and families with dealing with these diseases, that we would be seen as valuable members of an investment group, of an investment syndicate into a company. And that is being validated in what we're doing, and at least we're seeing that so far. One example is that we have been following some innovations at a place called Feinstein Institute, where they had been understanding the vagus nerve system, and especially the aspect and branch of the vagus nerve system that stimulates the spleen, where platelets are primed. This is a really important step in hemostasis, in the balance of bleeding and coagulation. And they'd done 20 years of research in that area. They had a lot of really promising data, basic science data, and data in mice. And then there was a company that had a non-invasive device for stimulating that branch of the vagus nerve system, and they were using that for another indication. And so it was really exciting for us to get involved as an early stage investor in this new entity that spun out of the research institute, but partnered with an existing company with the device, and where we could bring to bear what we understand about bleeding disorders along with these basic scientists. We could bring to bear our scientific advisory group and the hematologists that we work with and the patients and families that deal with this disease, and to have their input inform the development of the product, which is now on the market as a wellness product for heavy menstrual bleeding for now as it continues its path through regulatory affairs.
Yeah, I see this as like a three-legged stool. You have the venture, the patient advocacy, and the research. That it's a really powerful triangulation of resources, particularly for rare disease.
Yeah, and it's one of those things, and as Casey knows as well, just the finance or the science or the clinical or the law are not sufficient. Those areas really they're all critical, but they're not sufficient unless the representatives of those groups, all those smart people, really play nice together. And so one of our roles as a benevolent investing organization is to help facilitate that cooperation.
Yeah, I like that. Looking kind of globally in countries where local foundations or research infrastructure doesn't necessarily exist, from your perspective, what can journalists or advocates do to catalyze the first wave of organization and awareness that would help be a starting point for this?
If it's, I think if it's in a specific rare disease area, there are often world organizations, even though my venture philanthropy fund is part of the National Bleeding Disorders Foundation, which is a national organization in the United States. They work closely with the World Federation of Hemophilia that works worldwide in bleeding disorders. So as a journalist, if you're looking at a specific area of rare disease, look for those worldwide advocacy groups as a really great source of content and expertise. So as you do your due diligence and you dive deep into the research for that article, for that piece of journalism, that you have them as a resource and an advocate. And every community is different around the world, as you all know, and it's really important to have that perspective and to be able to take it into consideration in understanding how to reach the right people.
Yeah. So that dovetails nicely into my next question, which is around storytelling. And you have such an interesting background as a scientist, investor, and closely working with patient groups. As you work with the scientists, investors, and patient groups, these worlds don't always talk the same language. And so how do you think storytelling can bridge that gap, or how have you seen it done elegantly?
It's absolutely the way to bridge that gap. It's why what the people in this room, this virtual room, it's why what they are doing is so important. And I also work closely with an excellent journalist named Beth Marshall at the National Bleeding Disorders Foundation. And she's just one of my most valued colleagues because she is so good at storytelling. I might do a first draft of something, and she dives in deeper and looks at it from a different perspective and always does the job of telling the story for multiple audiences. So I think storytelling is absolutely critical. As Casey says, focus on the people that are involved and build it from there. But also very importantly, as you're telling that human interest story, do your due diligence, dive deeply, really understand the different aspects of the policy issues and barriers that are going on, understand the legal issues around what's going on, the regulatory issues, the finance issues, make sure it's a comprehensive approach with that human interest story at the center. And one of the things that I found too over the 40 plus years that I've been doing this is that when it comes to policymakers, often where they really pay attention to information is when it's in the news. You can prepare briefings for their staffers. You can talk with them at conferences, but what gets their attention is what they read in the publications that they read every day, in the newspapers and so forth. So this is absolutely critical, what you do and how you deliver those messages, and in a way that's comprehensive, well-researched, and where the references or where folks can go for more information.
So you just touched on a number of different, issues surrounding the topic today. So from your experience, what is the most important story that's not being told about rare disease innovation, and how might the press, possibly change that?
It's the role of patients and their families in product development. So one of the things, since we launched this fund in 2023, it's a very new initiative. We've talked to over 220 innovative companies, and a common theme with all of them, even though they have strong business plans, they have strong boards of directors and key opinion leaders and scientific advisory groups, they're engaging patients too late in the process. It should be even at a preclinical stage. They should be listening to those individuals, what matters to them, what makes a new treatment compelling, what really has to happen. These companies are putting together regulatory pathways that will get the drug approved, but not in a way where it's going to be embraced by that population of people who need it. So that's, going through a traditional route. And what that means is that there was an opportunity probably to get there faster, better with something that would have a greater impact on those patients. And from a business standpoint, they don't get the market uptick that they need to be successful. And what happens then? They drop the product. So from a very, looking at both the impact side and the business side, which is required to deliver, in this case, a product to a patient, engaging them early is the right thing to do morally, but it is absolutely critical in bringing the right product to the patient faster, better. And I think that's an area that we're starting to see some lip service to, but we're not seeing it embraced by even early stage biotech companies the way it could be. And so this is an area that we're really paying attention to. And the other is diversity in clinical trials.
Yeah.
And we're looking a lot at women and girls with bleeding disorders. And this is a universal issue across a lot of different medications, as most of them have only been tested on basically white males. And in order to really understand and to develop the best products, it's got to be one that's vetted with a diverse group of individuals, because that's what we are in the world, a diverse group.
Yeah. I want to open it up and pause a minute to answer some questions from our audience. And this will be both for Casey and Teri. One being, what strategies can be used to encourage governments in developing countries where basic healthcare systems are still under strain to dedicate more financial resources to addressing rare diseases? So strategies to encourage governments.
Well, just because the camera's still on me, I guess we will. One of the things, again, is to go to those world organizations, so that there are disease-specific foundations that have a world organization. They're a great place to work with, to understand country by country or region by region, what can we do, where are the unmet needs, where are there solutions that could be delivered here, and then who else could we partner to get them to the right place in the right time. I don't think there's any easy solution, but there's always so much nuance in an individual region that is, there's got to be a way to work locally, but with the support of a world organization.
Yeah. Casey, were you gonna?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I think we're looking for is sustainability, and like healthcare systems that are already strained. You're working with hard to access medicines, more patients than you have clinicians. And so I would say, one thing is that if you look at a hospital less of like a place to just diagnose patients, but paired with scientific, there's great scientists in every country. And you pair those two together, you get a diagnosed patient. You can make these drugs preclinical for pretty cheap, and a patent can be filed. And between like that relationship, when you take a patient through that process, you can create an immense amount of value. And so to me, if I was in a developing country and I had some sort of control over a healthcare system, one of the things I would do is I would actually start making those treatments there, because then you can license those out to a pharma company anywhere in the world, because these are global products. Even if there's only 50 patients or 100 patients or whatever, which most of these diseases are, that they can create some sustainable revenue for that burgeoning, or for that struggling healthcare system. So I think that's one way to look at it. And I think another way to look at it is we are moving into a precision medicine cult. Like that is the next wave of healthcare, where it's not this cattle call of grouping most people into these sort of big, vague, what we call phenotypically diagnosed diseases. So it's like, well, you look like this, so I'm going to tell you that you got this disease. So now that we have genetic sequencing, we can actually know the underlying cause of what you're struggling with or what your ailment is. And so I think there are inexpensive ways to move a healthcare clinic into this kind of more modern thing. And so it builds the trust with your patients. It will highlight the wins that you have with patients. I'll give you one example. We had a patient come to us through our lab, and she was a 14-year-old girl. She was starting to have seizures. No one knew what was going on. And we ran a genetic sequence on her, and we found a mutation that did have a drug, but what it also said was, if you do not eat these things and you do eat these things, that you can really manage the symptoms. And as soon as she did that, her seizures went away. She was able to go to summer camp that summer, and so there are sometimes really like actionable things that a clinic can do that will cost very little money to do them, but you can't know until you get that diagnosis, you know. And so I think those are ways by you guys connecting different pieces. And to Teri's point, if you don't have access, if you don't have resources there in your country, there are other resources outside your country you can bring in for partnerships.
Yeah.
Well, Casey, too, I think that's really compelling, because the idea is you may have a healthcare clinic in a region or a country that may be able to do some of these things that you couldn't do in the US.
Absolutely.
Could do through doing a smart, disciplined, starting with whole genome sequencing approach. You could really do some things and set the example for the US and a lot of other places.
Please.
Agreed.
So you hit on a little bit of this, Casey, but Simone asks, can you discuss some of the ways that patients can contribute to the design of a trial, from recruitment to accessibility to outcomes and measures?
Oh yeah, I mean, it's one of the conversations that's being had now is that the way we've done it in the past is that we make a drug, we file an IND, you know, we're ready to go to clinic, and now we got to go look for patients. And so what that means is that the company wasn't prepared to actually treat the patients. So they don't even know necessarily what the patients are struggling with. They don't even really know what the patients consider meaningful changes. And they don't even know where their patients are. And so they spend millions of dollars being in clinical trials because they didn't start with the patient. They started with a drug. And with what rare disease gives us, this really unique opportunity, is to actually start with patients. What are they struggling with? What is the thing that if they could have a wish list of changes that this drug did, that this treatment or cure could accomplish? What are those? Well, that begins to inform your, obviously, kind of your endpoints in a clinical trial, but it also, strangely enough, also informs your preclinical work, your science work. I can't tell you how many times we've ran into a patient and they said, you know, I think they struggle with communication. And if it's a neuro drug, we actually look for certain neurons, the type of neurons in your brain that are alongside the area in your brain for communication. And we want to test those because we want to make sure the drug works on that. So it can inform all kinds of little pieces if you're communicating with the patients and the clinicians that really understand that disease. And I think we can't get to scale with these treatments without that sort of relationship with patients in the very beginning.
I agree. And it's not just the clinicians, it's not just the key opinion leaders in the disease. They'll know a lot and they're really important, but they don't often see it from the patient's perspective. And that's really important. So the National Bleeding Disorders Foundation has a program called Community Voices in Research. And so it's a program for engaging patients and their families in clinical trials and discussions about research and so forth. And it's really powerful. And the other disease-specific foundations may have similar programs, and actually a lot of them do. But I think Casey makes an important point. It's not just the clinical studies, but it's the preclinical studies when you're starting to decide what kind of things are you going to look at? What, biomarkers, for example, which are you going to use? Why? What other aspects of day-to-day life do you want to consider? Are there assays that might correlate with that we want to use? And again, by doing this, even before you get into the clinical stage, even before you're testing on people, you can often compress the timeline to getting to clinical trials and compress your clinical trial timelines. Very, very important. Patient perspective, patient perspective, patient perspective. And the other area that helped some of our constituents has been really having detailed information about how to talk to your physician and what questions to ask them, what to insist on, and how to advocate for yourself. So this is ongoing work at our foundation, but it's a really important area, and one that, as as outstanding journalists yourself, is an area that you can touch on and research and share.
Yeah, thank you. Evans has a good question going back to funding startups that have promising innovation. Rare disease startups have shown that they often struggle to secure traditional venture capital due to the small patient population, high research costs, and long timelines. What are the main barriers these startups face when approaching traditional investors, and how do alternative funding mechanisms help fill this gap and support innovation? I guess the question is, outside of having the small patient populations, what do you see as the other main barriers to connecting with the RA capitals of the world?
Yeah, I think, and this is certainly in the environment we're in right now, most of your traditional top tier investors are going to want to see phase 2 data anymore before you invest. Not all of them. There are still some that are investing early, especially if it's platform technology, which is the way you're approaching drug development, may be applicable to a lot of different diseases and drugs. But I think the rule of thumb that's been true decade by decade is, can you find funding to do clinical proof of principle and reduce some risk so that you're positioned to attract smart money and management that you need to get this product all the way to patients. And so that's what you're always trying to do. And for us, that's a big part of our effort, is that part of our investment criteria involves, can we put this thing in a position to attract smart money and management?
Yeah. And that's part of our, Invest in Cures is highlighting not only what the venture philanthropy groups are doing, but how we could build bridges to traditional VCs and show the stories of, the Pathways to Cures comes in for early investment, gets it to a point where now it's attractive to traditional venture, which it is happening. And we're happy to report that we're seeing more and more traditional venture interested in rare. And I think, Jerry, you can chime in on this. You have a better perspective, but with platform technologies where there's multiple,
Yeah, part of our thesis too was to say, I know that this rare bleeding disorder isn't going to be your big one. but it can be a really powerful clinical proof of principle that's going to give you a value inflection in your company. So what will it take for you to add a bleeding disorder to your pipeline? So, that's starting to, be validated and work, but it's still a struggle. We still need to find other non-traditional syndicate or co-investor partners as well. We are looking very hard at how we meet the right family offices, these, high net worth individuals who are part of families that usually have a philanthropy arm, but also an investment arm. And so they are, they're savvy investors, but they also are very impact oriented usually. And so trying to figure out how to put the right combinations of funding together, again, with the objective of how do you align interests so you can get this thing over the finish line so it can reach the people who need it most. It's really challenging. And what Casey has done with crowdfunding is really important. It's an excellent example. It's another way to fund where you're finding people who have a personal interest and want to see the impact. So just trying to figure out how to piece together government funding, grant funding, investor funding, angel funding, traditional funding, and getting that all to work together, and not one type of funding creating a barrier for the others. Can be daunting, but it's doable.
So I just want to go back to the topic of family office, because this is something that we're interested in highlighting, but oftentimes they're not interested in being highlighted. But I don't want to assume that our audience knows what family office is. Can you explain that a little bit more, and how maybe from a media perspective, even if they didn't want to have their name announced, there might be a way to craft a story around that?
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, this is an area of interest to us. And one of the things that's really daunting about it is there's nowhere you can look to just get a list of family offices and what they are interested in. There are brokers out there which will make introductions to you. And we went through a process where our opportunity was introduced to 4,000 family offices across the US and Europe. We got a good response rate. We were looking for donors for a fund. They were
And just really quick, really quickly, because I want you to continue, but just define family office first.
It's either one high net value family, a family that has lots of money and resources, and it's either one family or a group of families, and they've set up an entity, an organization that usually has two arms. One unit that does philanthropy, provides grants and donations to areas that are of interest to that family or group of families, or they make investments where they invest in companies and entities, everything from early stage to real estate that they have interest in. And so those for-profit arm, not for-profit arm, but they are viable, important organizations that have a lot of resources to put to work, but finding the right organization at the right time is daunting.
Yes. But it's an interesting, from a media perspective, you have someone who had a maybe successful exit in the company and their wife has a rare disease. They're extremely motivated to find that cure or treatment.
And this is where journalism comes in. A compelling story, a well-placed story, is one of the most powerful ways for enabling the right partner to find you.
Yep.
So they may want to stay kind of behind the scenes, confidential, but you get your story out there, get it out well, and that's how they find you, that individual who cares about this rare disease because it's impacted them personally.
Right. And that's really powerful. That transcends countries and regions. And Robert from Kenya has an interesting question. He says, I want to look inward and ask a personalized question around resources to enable storytellers to go out and tell these important stories. My question, therefore, is, given the resources for in-depth journalism are especially limited for freelancers in regions like East Africa, what practical strategies can we use to continuously produce high impact rare disease stories? Specifically, how can how can we sustainably leverage global patient advocacy networks for ongoing stories, ongoing story leads and access using, while ensuring our reporting remains deeply rooted in the context of the local community. That was a long one, but did you get the gist of it?
Yeah, I mean, I'll start and let Casey, of course, pipe in, and you may have some answers to that too, Becky. But I think as you start to develop partnerships with some of these organizations in your region and internationally and get to know them, let them know I'm looking for leads. These are the things I want to write about. I want to make sure they're well researched, searched stories where I've done proper due diligence. So I'm going to need you to point me at those resources as well. But I think it's about building your network of experts. And doing that, there is certainly Launch Bio is one of those organizations, and national organizations of rare disease and so forth. But there's a lot, but maybe we start in a certain disease area and branch out.
Yeah, and I like that someone put their LinkedIn connection, and I will do the same. And feel free to use me as a resource or connection point, rather. I'm less of an expert and more of a connector. Let's see. Are there any other?
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead, Casey.
I have a couple of comments. One on the struggling company part. So I think it's important to understand how we've invested, how we have built biotech and pharma, like how have medicines been made? And historically, they've been very expensive to make. And so you've needed a massive amount of investment capital to get a drug approved. And then, and so those are typically done with venture capital. And guess who venture capital raises all their money from? Family offices and high net worth individuals. And the issue that's in my opinion that has arisen here, because so they're making a $20 million, the venture capital may make a $20 million investment or a $50 million investment, but that's coming from potentially hundreds of high net worth individuals, other funds, family offices that have invested into their fund. Now, what happens is that the general partner of that fund has one goal: to return money back to those family offices. Because if they don't, they're never going to be able to start a fund again.
Right.
And so what is the mission of what I invest in is sacrificed, because I can't, as a general partner in a venture capital, it is very risky for me to have feelings about what I'm investing in. Because if I don't, I'm never going to be able to start a fund again if I'm not successful at this. Now, all those family offices and high net worth, I guarantee you they have opinions about where their money goes and what they do with it and why they do it, and so we have built an ecosystem, a healthcare system with a moral or a lack of purpose for the most part in how and why we invest. And I think this is where the opportunity lies is because what that has done is it's created a system of new technology that you build value and you sell it to the pharma company, because you really only have 7 to 12 years to sort of make that money back. And so everything is very short-sighted in that way to some degree, because you're trying to get that return before the fund closes. What I think, companies have an opportunity for is long-term thinking and actual revenue generating companies, as opposed to just building value and selling off to Bayer or Merck or Novartis, because that's most biotech companies never actually treat a patient, which is one thing I blew my mind that I learned. And so now we have the opportunity to build up startups and companies that are working with patients, building up these treatments and actually treating patients, and then connecting them with these, like what Teri was talking about, with with family offices, high net worth, and funds like Teri that have a purpose with their capital because they want it to make money, but they also want it to affect patients. So I think there's this really great convergence that if we can highlight those things around these new opportunities, it changes our way of thinking and it educates the investor.
Yeah,
So
I like
that
that.
was one thing I wanted to say.
And it's a unique opportunity for family offices. So they're making their returns through venture investing and through investing in real estate and so forth. But they can afford to be patient and they can afford to take a certain amount of their funding and do things that are riskier that may have a greater societal impact. It's just finding the right ones. And so, writing to appeal to family offices to use some of their wealth in this way and change the world could be a really compelling thing.
Rachel, I see you pop on. I know we're getting close on time.
We are, and I am uh, learning so much about this landscape that I am loath to interrupt, but I want to make sure that I do something that I told Casey I would sort of put him on the spot and hold him to in our prep conversation, because I think it's probably one of the most powerful ways of thinking about this issue that a journalist can have, particularly one who is interested in covering health issues. And you described the rare disease realm or covering it as one of the most important civil rights issues in the health sector. Please take us home in this discussion by characterizing that sentiment again.
Yeah, absolutely. So, in my journey, why was Rose never going to have a treatment? Why was my family left to suffer? Why, why? And was this just a happenstance and we call it rare, right? Whoever called these like this rare disease should be fired because it's the worst branding that you could have ever done on genetic disease because it's not rare. And I'll start with the numbers. So 400 million people suffer from these diseases. Half of those are children, and that number is growing. 30% of those children, this is millions of children, die before they see their fifth birthday. Only 5% of these 10,000 plus rare diseases actually have a treatment. Combined, this is bigger than cancer and AIDS. So, to give you a landscape of how much it touches our globe, and you could say, well, this is just one way people suffer. Well, when we look at the fact we do have technology to help these patients and these families, but we do nothing to change our systems to enable that technology, then it's on us. And like I said, these families are suffering. Some of these are hereditary, so you have generations of people dying early because nobody's doing anything about it. You've got lifetime of suffering, and the pharma business makes so much money right now with population medicine that I'm friends with some of these CEOs of large pharma companies, and they say, Casey, our ship, it's already built. We can't do this. And so now, if you look at some of the greatest like stains on our globe of how we have harmed and killed innocent groups of people, whether it was, the world wars or genocides that have happened, especially, the folks in Africa and the Middle East and China and the terrible stuff people have experienced. We're experiencing this now with these diseases, but we're not looking at it that way, because we've just sort of accepted it. And I don't know if you've ever been in an abusive environment, but you can get to the place where you just accept that this is my lot. And it's not until we realize that no, every human being matters. And every human being, no matter what country we're from, no matter how much money we make, should have access to a enabled life, right? And we've all experienced like human rights issues. And this to me is one of the big ones. And it's something that if we don't do anything about it, people will just keep dying and suffering. Millions of people every year will just keep dying and suffering. But if we do something about it, there is answers, technology, and things we can do to stop this problem for many of these diseases. And I would argue most of them, but it's going to take our courage. It's going to take our resilience as writers and as startup folks and as investors to be laser focused on changing this as a globe, and not one of us can do it alone, and so I think if we look at all of the great changes for human health and human equality and access, it's because many people have risen up and said, no more. I'm not going to take this. We're going to do something about it. And I think we're in that position now. We're in that chapter now for our globe. And I'm not going anywhere, and I don't think Teri and Becky are going anywhere. And so, I would love to, I hope that some of you writers will take this mantle on, and fight with your pen and your paper and your voice, to create this change.
Teri and Becky, I hate to put you in the position of trying to follow that, but please offer us your final thoughts as we wrap up this session.
Well, you're right. Those are hard statements to follow, but really appreciate and very inspirational. And it is something that we all have to think about every day, which is access. And if we can't create that system in the US, where can we create it? Because maybe it's not here. So stay tuned.
Yeah.
Thank you for letting me participate in this, and thank you for this important conference and for your work as journalists.
Yeah, and I echo that appreciation, and mine is more of a summary. As we discussed today, we have the tools to cure many of these diseases, but what we're lacking is alignment and the business model. I know we've mentioned that a number of times in policy frameworks. So that's where you all come in. As journalists, you have the power to turn patient stories into public priorities. So thank you for learning with us today and being interactive. Your questions were excellent. We'd love to stay in touch and be helpful in any way possible, and to the National Press Foundation for enabling us to have this conversation.
Becky, Teri, and Casey, thank you so much for concluding our training on a high note and for your inspiration and guidance to our journalists. And with that powerful conversation, we have reached the conclusion of the 2025 NPF Rare Disease Reporting Fellowship. On behalf of NPF, I want to extend sincere thanks to all of our distinguished speakers who provided our fellows with valuable context and advice about reporting on rare disease. All of the sessions from this training will be posted on our website at nationalpress.org and on our YouTube channel in the coming weeks. And on behalf of our fellows, I'd like to once again thank Foundation Ipsen for its continued support of NPF programming and its commitment to improving the ability of journalists around the world to amplify the lived experience of people living with rare disease.